Welcome to the Regulation podcast from the Institute of Regulation. My name is Martial Bou, the chair of the Institute and a regulator myself. This episode of our podcast focuses on a risk to all regulators and something that regulators can be accused of when people don't like their decisions: regulatory capture. The podcast will explain what it means, including who wants to capture regulators and why, and how regulators can avoid getting caught. We're joined by two expert academics who have researched this topic and who will help us through the territory. Let me introduce them. Dr. Eva Heims is a senior lecturer at the University of York in the United Kingdom, researching regulation with a particular focus on regulatory agencies and regulatory capture. She previously worked at the London School of Economics, where she completed her PhD, and taught at King's College London too. Among her recent publications is a paper in Regulation and Governance called The Mechanics of Regulatory Capture, Testing Claims of Industry Influence in the Case of Vioxx, which I believe is an anti-inflammatory drug that was withdrawn from the US market. Welcome, Eva.
Thank you very much for having me.
And Dr. Justin Rex is an assistant professor of public administration at Bowling Green University in the United States. He also researches regulatory policy with a focus on regulatory capture and financial regulation. He previously worked at Shawnee State University and Wayne State University, where he got his PhD. One of his recent publications is an article also in Regulation and Governance called Anatomy of Agency Capture, an organizational typology for diagnosing and remedying capture, which sounds very interesting. Welcome to you, Justin, too.
Thank you for having me.
Great. So we've got lots of expertise around the table here. So thanks to you both for coming on. Eva, can I start with you? The paper you published talks about regulatory capture, and our audience is mainly regulators, but that phrase might sound to some like a bit of jargon. So can you explain what you mean by regulatory capture and how does it differ from the kind of normal discussions that regulated bodies want to have with their regulator?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really important question. So regulatory capture really refers to a situation in which regulated entities, for example, exert excessive influence on their regulator. And by excessive, we mean influence that is harmful. So influence that shifts a regulator's actions to serving the needs, the requests, the wants of particular regulated entities, for example, and does it at the expense of other regulated entities or other groups in society or even society at large. So we're talking about a situation that is very different to regular conversations between regulated bodies and their regulator. And that can happen through many different ways. It could be that both sides of the fence, so to speak, share worldviews because they've gone through the same educational programs or share social networks, and regulators may not be able to really critically question those they regulate. But it can happen even to the best intentioned regulator out there, because sometimes regulated entities have such an information advantage, for example, that they just battle their regulator into submission by supplying so much information and such complex information that they know the regulator won't have time to do anything but sift through that information and then almost accidentally base the action on that type of information supplied by regulated entities, for example. So it can happen through many different ways, but it's all about harmful influence.
Okay, there's a massive amount already there in what you've just said. Excessive influence and the different ways in which the regulated entities can have influence over their regulators. So we're going to come back to some of that because there's a lot in what you've said already. But before we do, Justin, I imagine you agree with Eva on a lot of this, but do you have anything to add so far to her definition?
Sure. Yeah, largely I agree with Eva, and I think the larger scholarship is kind of coming and coalescing to a definition similar to what Eva had said. And so I think one just other thing to highlight is the distinction between sort of regular interactions or conversations that regulators are going to be having through their everyday work, whether it's through an inspection process, through an event, or in the US, where regulators will propose rules and industry and other public groups will give feedback. all of those are typical interactions we would expect regulators to have with regulated parties and don't inherently mean that there's capture going on during those conversations. However, as Ava said, those regular types of interactions can potentially lead to influence. And again, even if regulated parties are influencing the decisions, that doesn't necessarily mean there's capture. But when we see marketed shifts in regulatory policy in favor of regulated entities, and when we see that happen regularly over time, then we're getting into the territory where we might be suspecting that there's capture going on, where we're not achieving sort of the public purposes or the public interest that regulation was set up to achieve.
Okay, so that's great. So what we're talking about is a question of degree, it sounds, so it's not a kind of binary switch-like off or on thing, but it's about when the normal conversations that take place between regulators and those they regulate kind of become a little bit excessive or too much, and there's undue influence. So let's move from the theory to some practical examples of where you think regulatory capture might have taken place. Ava, let me start with you again. Your article talks about a drug in the United States. So whether that or another case, can you give us an example of regulatory capture in practice?
Thank you. Yeah, so that particular case actually isn't necessarily a case of capture, or at least not of something that we may want to call strong capture. It was a drug withdrawn from the market because it was found to cause heart attacks and strokes. Unfortunately, we often don't know enough about risks of drugs when they first come onto the market. And in that piece of research, I'm really trying to dissect the decision-making of regulators and to show that they did their work well. They did consider all the information available. They did what they could, so to speak, and it wasn't really a result of excessive industry influence or the influence of the manufacturer of the drug that led to the bad outcome. And this is what we often see. We see a bad outcome and allegations of capture are immediately in the room. And that's where we actually need to be far more critical in distinguishing bad outcomes from outcomes that are capture, that could mean that we see a bad regulatory outcome because we had capture, or we could even not notice for a while. And that's where we really need to understand whether we're looking at soft capture or strong capture. It's a matter of degree, as you just said. There are different shades of gray. And soft capture is probably fairly common, but strong capture actually isn't. One example that probably many scholars at least would agree on, that people would be familiar with, was the now defunct Minerals Management Service ahead of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, where many scholars and other observers agree that this particular regulator saw itself as acting really to facilitate the drilling operations of oil companies rather than managing the risks associated with drilling. And there were exceptionally close shared social networks at play between the regulator and the regulated bodies. But as often, it only really became public knowledge after the big disaster. And what we need to do is to understand and focus on detecting capture before, even soft capture before catastrophe strikes or bad outcomes appear.
Okay, well, it's good to hear that academics can't see too many examples of what you've called strong capture. But obviously, I think we would all agree that these things are going to be hard to spot. So I'd be interested in a moment in asking you what regulators can do to prevent capture, soft or strong in your terminology. But before we come on to that, Justin, in the article I mentioned when introducing you, you produced a typology of regulatory capture. And I imagine you've got some examples that you found when you conducted your research as well. So can you add some others to the example of in the Gulf of Mexico that Ava mentioned?
Sure. The case study that I used in that article looked at banking regulation in the United States leading up to the global financial crisis. And so one example I found of weak capture was at a regulator called the Office of Thrift Supervision that regulated part of the banking sector. And one thing that we found with all of the fancy and sometimes convoluted financial products that banks and other institutions were churning out was that there's a quote from one of the regulators at that agency during a investigation post-crisis. And basically, he admitted to being captured. He said that he got too close to the products that the institutions were putting out. And so what seemed maybe risky or exotic initially sort of just became the water that he was swimming in. And so he said he sort of got too close to these products and ceased to be able to provide some of that independent judgment that we would want a regulator to provide. And so I think that's an example where, again, these kind of networks and swimming in that water that you are swimming in every day with regulated entities, and sometimes you can get a bit lost or cease to provide that independent judgment.
Yes, that's very interesting. I know that there has been a lot of research done on the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and the role that regulators played, and others, obviously. So that's a really interesting one. I know that there's all kinds of disputed views on what caused that and the role that the regulators played there. So that's very interesting. So we've talked about the risk that regulators are captured by those they regulate. But maybe we can say something about others who might want to capture the regulate too, whether politicians in government or even members of the public or others who have lobbying responsibilities. Justin, are there risks of regulatory capture from those parties too?
Sure. So one thing I talked about in my article is looking at elected officials and their one avenue through which business can exert influence on regulatory agencies. And so if they are lobbying hard for deregulatory actions, for example, the elected officials, they can pressure elected officials to enact sort of form of legislative capture or statutory capture on regulatory agencies that regulatory agencies may not be able to combat, given that legislators may control budgets and statutes and things like that. And so trying to figure out whether we see capture there is one thing I tried to do in the article. Is I looked at this hypothesis related to electorally sanctioned pro-business regulation. So here, maybe we see a shift in public attitudes towards regulation where there's a more deregulatory mindset, and politicians get elected up based on that, and they deregulate the financial industry in accordance with those public preferences. So maybe regulators wouldn't agree with that, but they would be, acting on democratic principles by following it. And so I sort of ruled out that hypothesis in my article leading up to the financial crisis in the U.S. because we didn't see a shift in public opinion, but we did see a massive shift in deregulation coming from elected officials, the president as well as Congress in the U.S. And so that was an example of sort of deregulatory or sabotage capture, as some people call it in the literature, where we saw lots of deregulatory acts that weren't consistent with any shift in public opinion, but was more consistent with shifts in pressure by business interests and financial interests to get more deregulation.
Goodness. Well, there's a whole different topic there about the way that regulators work with politicians and respond to democratic, as you say, democratically elected politicians who are giving signals to regulators about policy decisions. And obviously, regulators have to be responsive democratically as well. But there's a fascinating topic there. Okay, so coming back to regulatory capture, what regulators will want to know is how can they spot the signs of capture so that they can be alert to those risks. So, Justin, back to you. What would you say are the early indications that regulators might be at risk of being captured?
Sure. I think each regulatory agency has, a publicly statute where there's some governing principles about the principles that they're supposed to follow in terms of some conception of the public interest. And so I think when we can get into discussions of capture, it's when decisions can't be justified or based around that public mandate, that sense of the public interest that we would expect. And so if we can rule out other explanations for why regulators are taking a particular action. So if we can't tie it back to that public mandate or that sense of public interest, then that might be a sign that capture could be present. If we can't rule out that there's public support for a particular action, then we may be more likely to see capture. So can we rule out other plausible explanations is one indication. And as I mentioned before, too, when we see repeated decisions that favor the regulated industry, that might be another indication. So it's not necessarily that one decision may favor the industry, but if we see repeated instances of that, then we become a little bit more suspicious that capture may be present, or that, as Ava said, there may be shared worldviews that are leading the regulator to distort the mission or divert themselves from a more robust sense of the public interest that we expect them to serve.
Very interesting. Okay, I'm taking two things away from that. One, about patterns of decisions, and second, about the evidential base for decisions and whether it's linked to the remit of the organization. Ava, what's your perspective on these kind of early signs that regulators can look out for?
I completely agree with what Justin's just said. And unfortunately, of course, there aren't sort of very easy signs that we can spot and stop and take stock. So often it is about having robust mechanisms in place to review decisions that have perhaps already been taken to make sure that feeds into ongoing decision making. Because while things are happening, it can be incredibly difficult, especially if you're sitting within an organization, to really understand how you're operating in that moment and why. So I think generally speaking, we want to understand, be it from within a regulator or an external person like us as scholars, we want to understand why a regulator was or is taking a particular decision, or isn't taking a decision, isn't taking action. And a key sign, I'd say, that things may be moving in the direction of capture, or may be problematic, is if we don't see critical questioning of positions advanced by regulated entities or demands made by them. It may still be that a decision is taken that is based on what, for example, regulated entities were advocating, but within the process, often we'd expect that there is robust discussion, we may want to call it, that shows that a regulator is able to step outside that relationship and understand its own relationship with those entities critically, and is able to question the types of arguments and information coming out of regulated entities critically, meaning often drawing on other types of expertise and information that are coming from more independent sources, for example.
Right. Okay. So what I'm hearing in what you've just said there, Ava, speaking as a regulator myself, is the importance of culture within the regulator, the importance of a care for evidence and authority, but also governance issues, whether internally in terms of the discussions that take place before decisions are made, or externally with maybe Parliament in the UK context, who have select committees to explore the effectiveness of regulators, or others, including the transparency that is offered by regulators to the regulated community by explaining decisions and talking them through. So that's what I'm hearing in terms of actions that regulators can take. But what else can regulators do to spot the signs of capture, but also to stop it from happening in the first place? Ava, back to you.
Another excellent question, because I think this is exactly what we would suggest regulators should do, to put a system in place that makes it possible for them to prevent capture by detecting it early, or by putting a system in place that makes capture much less likely to happen in the first place. Again, unfortunately, it's not straightforward. There aren't kind of a few tick boxes for making sure that capture is ruled out. It is really about ongoing evaluation of how one operates as an organization. But on balance, capture becomes less likely the more checkpoints, so to speak, are involved in decision making within a regulator. So the more independent advisory groups are involved, or perhaps even internal so-called devil's advocates committees that are tasked with challenging the internal kind of logics and ways of taking decision, be it generally or on particular cases in an enforcement proceeding, for example. As well as perhaps thinking about having a committee in place that reviews past processes of decision-making to check for capture, and that then can feed in to ongoing decision-making, as I mentioned earlier. And this last example of a review committee, so to speak, is something that I think is much less common in practice than some of the other mechanisms I've mentioned. Also a very deliberate recruitment strategy that aims at getting diverse points of view into the organization. Many factors that can be out of the control of a regulator to a certain extent. So having a high research capacity or in-house kind of information gathering capacity to get independent information can be really powerful as a safeguard against capture. But of course, budgets are always limited and not fully under regulators' control. But these are some of the things that regulators could think about, I think.
I think those are really, really excellent suggestions, Ava, and certainly stuff for us to all think about when those of us who are working in regulators. Justin, from your perspective, if a regulator's been captured, what do they do? Do they need to change their strategy or their staff or both?
I think it can be all of those things, and as Ava mentioned, there's a lot of variables and review processes that can act as a check. And one other thing I'd like to add is thinking about, when we talk about capture, we talk about often the industry, the regulated industry and the regulator, but there are a diverse set of stakeholders that are involved in the regulatory process. And so I think managing those external stakeholders, having other public interest groups, whether it's academics, other researchers, that they can draw on for information, but also act as an independent check. Also managing the reputation of the regulatory organization. And so some of that is doing good work, making decisions that are sound based in the evidence, but some of it's also things like interacting with the other branches of government, right? And having that reputation. And so that you've got a strong public purpose built up for the agency and a reputation that the agency is doing, having a sound judgment and doing good work. And I think that can help ward off too much excess influence from the industry when you've got other stakeholders that can act as a basis for support. One of the early books and articles about capture talked about regulatory agencies in the US that over time, there was an initial burst of energy where the agency had a lot of public support. Maybe there was a crisis, and so the agency was created and there's a lot of goodwill. But over time, that goodwill may erode or people may get diverted in their attention. And so over time, it may be only the agencies, their only basis of support might be the industry itself. And so I think agencies can take an active role in trying to maintain those good relationships and other stakeholders so that they don't just have to rely on the regulated industry for support.
That's incredibly wise advice in terms of making sure that there are a wide range of stakeholders who understand the regulator and its decisions, and that the regulator also communicates its decisions effectively to the widest possible group of people who are affected. So I think that's really helpful, I have to say, Justin. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to move on to a specific topic I just want to ask your views on, which is the so-called revolving door, where people move between working for the regulator and then into the regulated community, or vice versa. Obviously, some people don't like it, alleging that it's in some way corrupt because people have worked for the regulator, then they move to the bank or the energy firm that they're regulating. But other people obviously recommend it because you have regulators with better knowledge of the sector that they're regulating. So do either of you have a view on that issue and the role of bodies as we have in the UK, which is called the COBA, the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments, which is supposed to check some of this stuff? Ava, can I start with you?
Yeah, sure. The revolving door, I think, had to come up because, as you say, that's the one concept or kind of buzzword that always gets used, and that can create quite a bit of kind of emotion within people, because many people associate it, like you say, with almost a level of corruption. So it always gets a bad press, but it's usually unfair because, as you say, many regulators that are able to recruit people who've come from regulated entities understand much better how the sector works in practice, gain insider knowledge. It helps them to know where the skeletons are buried, so to speak. But I think what is crucial and what may not always be the case is that regulators understand how exposed they are to the revolving door and what that means for how they operate. So, in other words, gathering data on where people you recruit are coming from and where people who leave your organization are going to can be really important. And what's really important there is that I think often when we hear about revolving door, we hear about high-level appointments. So people at the very top level of a regulatory organization coming in from regulated entities. And as far as I know, bodies such as ACOBA also focus far more on kind of the more executive levels of the organization. But I think regulators really should get insight into where the whole staff body comes from, because what I'm far more worried about is influence that operates through far less tangible mechanisms by having a staff body that comes overwhelmingly from similar educational or even the same educational programs and regulated entities. And unless you track that quite proactively, you may not know how exposed you are to these kind of, let's say, shared community effects that can be a result of the revolving door. So in other words, I think we need to take a differentiated view on the revolving door and not see it necessarily as a bad thing, but also stay realistic about risks involved with this happening.
Yeah, goodness. Again, very helpful and interesting. Justin, from the US perspective, anything to add?
Sure. I think as your question and as Ava's comments have indicated, there's some nuance involved in the revolving door. And I think there can be a reactionary impulse to reject it. But even in the scholarly community, there are a lot of nuanced views. And so there's a quote from a famous regulatory scholar, John Braithwaite, but he was studying the revolving door in the Australian context. And he said, we should let the revolving door spin for all it's worth, given some of the informational benefits and expertise benefits that we can get when we see people going in and out of the sector. And particularly in sectors that are highly complex and technical, sometimes those insiders can provide some insight for regulators or know what's going on the inside that regulators may not have any access to. Sort of a central challenge is this information asymmetry that's often going on. The revolving door can be one way to reduce that information asymmetry, as long as people are coming from the industry into government to help reduce that asymmetry, not in nefarious ways. But another theme running through the discussion is this matter of degrees, right? Degrees of capture, and I think the same can be applied here. Is that we can get some of those informational benefits by having people come from the industry going into government, or vice versa, but when we see too much of the personnel at an agency, for example, being drawn from the industry, regulators may lose that sense of independence. And so having other people that aren't necessarily drawn from the industry or can provide some independent perspective, I think is really important so that regulators don't get too tied to one particular worldview.
That's, again, very helpful indeed. And again, it's the lesson is for us to be aware, and to have information. So I hope that this podcast helps by drawing to people's attention some of the issues, and we will flag on our website some of the other material that is available. And you're very welcome, both of you, Ava and Justin, to send us some stuff that our members might be interested in. So let's wrap up now with a final question to you each. Maybe what one thing, for those people listening to this who are working in regulation, what one thing would you advise them to do whether to find out more or to be aware of the issues in their own regulatory organization? Justin, let's kick off with you.
Sure. I think, reading some of the work we've discussed today, or I know Ava has written some work based on her recent project, grant-funded project that's talks about regulatory capture in a practical way and offers some guides. And I think in the States, the Penn program on regulation, they have been attentive to this issue. This is out of the University of Pennsylvania, but on their blog, they have a whole series written by academics, but also some practitioners about regulatory capture, some short articles that really talk about it in a practical way and give some good examples of when it has happened and when it hasn't, and it discuss a lot of the questions that we discussed here today. One last thing, if you let me give more than one thing, is Ava and I just attended and presented on a panel at the International Association of Regulatory Governance, a new organization that's been established and just had its first annual conference. And so we presented on regulatory capture there. But one thing I found really exciting from that conference is that there were a lot of academics, but there were also a lot of practitioners there, people working in government, former regulators, and who become academics and so on. And so there was a lot of productive conversation where I think academics can learn from practitioners, because even though we think we may know everything, we don't. And regulators, could learn from us as well. And so I think that back and forth was really helpful, and just having that dialogue where we can translate what seems like a very academic concept like capture to practitioners, and they can tell us whether we're right or wrong, I think that's really helpful as well.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And as it happens, I was presenting online to that conference as well with colleagues from Australia and New Zealand about building regulatory communities of practitioners, precisely so that we can spread this kind of learning and build good practice in people who are actually doing the job. So thank you both for that contribution, and we'll make sure that some of that material is available to our members through our website as well. So Ava, I'm going to give the final word to you, whether on this point about what people should take away or anything else that we've been discussing on regulatory capture.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I agree with everything that both of you have just mentioned to kind of foster the community. To exchange practices and views between academics and scholars is fantastic. And that I think also ties in with my final thought, which is I think that when it comes to capture, the most important thing that regulators can do is to think carefully and honestly about how regulatory capture might affect the organization. And I think also to learn from other regulators and bodies such as the Institute of Regulation really can play and are playing a really important role here. By providing a forum for exchange and discussion, as do the type of conferences we just mentioned. So I think it's never a subject you can simply tick off of your list. It involves ongoing kind of critical self-examination of your own organization and your practices. And that's always easier done when you talk to others who are in similar jobs, but in other organizations. So I think it's fantastic work that the Institute is doing here as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. It's been an absolutely fantastic discussion. Thank you, Dr. Ava Heims from York University and Dr. Justin Rex from Bowling Green University, USA. That's the end of this podcast, with thanks also to our sound engineer, Neil Bowerman from Bowerman Audio Production. And thank you to those of you listening. I hope you found the discussion interesting. If you have, do let your colleagues know about it and tune in to future episodes where we will discuss other issues of interest to regulators. And you can find other material and events relevant to regulation at the Institute of Regulation's website, ioregulation.org. Thanks again for listening to me, Martial Bou, at the Regulation Podcast. Good luck with your own regulatory challenges, and do stay in touch with each other and with the Institute to help UK regulation become the best it can. Goodbye.